In the year 1849, in a small frontier town, something happened that people would whisper about for generations, especially when winter winds rattled shutters and snow gathered like silent witnesses along frozen fences. It was the coldest season anyone could remember, a winter that pressed its white weight upon rooftops and hearts alike, when kindness was measured not in words but in firewood, bread, and open doors. There lived a man who believed survival belonged only to the strong, and when his neighbor knocked beneath a sky heavy with snow, he chose silence over mercy, a choice that would not remain buried. For in that valley, where pine trees bent under frost and wolves cried beyond the ridge, one refusal during the winter of 1849 would shape destinies more surely than any storm. The town lay tucked between rolling hills and a winding river that had long since frozen solid, its surface dull and gray beneath a sky the color of cold iron. Wooden cabins lined a narrow road carved by wagon wheels, smoke rising thinly from chimneys, drifting sideways in the bitter wind that carried the scent of pine and distant snow. Icicles hung from eaves like glass daggers, horses stamped in their stalls, and the church bell rang softly each Sunday, its echo swallowed by the vast white silence surrounding the settlement. Winters in that part of the territory were never gentle, yet the winter of 1849 came early and lingered with stubborn cruelty, freezing wells and cracking beams within poorly built barns. Among the townsfolk lived a man named Silas Turner, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with a beard streaked by frost and age, known for his discipline and his careful, guarded ways. Silas had come west years before, chasing opportunity like so many others, and through relentless work he had built the largest storehouse in town, filled with grain, salted meat, and firewood. He believed in preparation above all things, rising before dawn, counting supplies by lantern light, tightening every latch, sealing every crack where winter might steal warmth or food. His cabin stood slightly apart from the others, closer to the tree-line, sturdy and well-kept, its shutters thick, its door reinforced, its windows glowing warmly each night. Yet only a few yards away stood a smaller cabin, humbler and worn, where his neighbor Elias Moore lived with his wife and young daughter, their roof patched with mismatched boards. Elias was thinner, quieter, a man whose hands bore the marks of honest labor, though recent illness had weakened him, and his harvest that autumn had fallen short. The townsfolk knew Elias struggled, and many had quietly shared what little they could spare, though winter stretched long and resources grew scarce for everyone. Silas noticed the visits to Elias's cabin, the exchanged bundles, the whispered concerns, and while he said nothing, a tightening settled in his jaw each time he passed their door. For in Silas's mind, hardship was a lesson meant to be endured alone, and he feared that generosity would chip away at the careful fortress he had built against hunger and loss. Beyond the hills, clouds gathered once more, thick and bruised with coming snow, and the wind carried a warning that this winter had not yet shown its worst. The storm arrived one evening without ceremony, rolling over the hills like a silent army, swallowing the last light of day and erasing the narrow road beneath drifting waves of snow. Silas barred his door before the first heavy flake struck, stacking extra logs beside the hearth, listening with quiet satisfaction to the steady crackle of his well-tended fire. Across the narrow stretch of frozen ground, Elias struggled to secure loose boards against the rising wind, coughing into his sleeve, his breath pale against the darkening sky. That night the temperature fell sharply, water stiffened in buckets, and frost crept like white veins along cabin walls, seeking weakness in wood and spirit alike. By morning, snow lay knee-deep, and the town awoke to the groan of straining beams and the distant cry of a horse that had broken free from its stall. Silas stepped outside briefly, surveying the damage, calculating the days of fuel required if the storm lingered, his boots crunching with measured confidence across the hardened crust. He saw Elias attempting to chop frozen wood, each swing slower than the last, the axe blade glancing weakly from stubborn knots in the timber. For a moment, Silas considered offering a bundle from his storehouse, yet he tightened his coat instead and turned away, convincing himself that foresight deserved reward. Later that afternoon, a hesitant knock sounded at his door, soft at first, nearly lost beneath the moan of wind along the eaves. Silas stood still beside the hearth, staring at the latch as though it might move of its own accord, the knock coming again, firmer, edged with urgency. When he opened the door a narrow crack, snow swirled inward, and Elias stood there, hat clutched tightly, eyes weary but steady. "My wood is nearly gone," Elias said quietly. "The child is fevered, and the wind finds every gap in our walls." Silas felt the warmth of his own fire at his back, smelled the stew simmering slowly, and for a brief heartbeat his resolve wavered. "I prepared for winter," Silas replied, voice even, "and I warned you in autumn that the cold would not be kind." Elias nodded once, shame flickering across his face, yet he did not step away, snow gathering upon his shoulders like a silent plea. "I will repay you come spring," he said, "with labor, with harvest, with whatever strength I can muster." Silas's gaze drifted toward his stacked provisions, counted and recounted through many long nights, each bundle a shield against the memory of past hunger. "The storm may last weeks," Silas answered, "and if I share with one, others will follow, and none of us will survive the lean months ahead." The wind howled between them, pressing Elias's coat against his thin frame, rattling the shutters as though urging a different decision. At last Silas closed the door slowly, not in anger, but in deliberate certainty, the latch falling into place with a sound far louder than the storm. Outside, footsteps retreated through deepening snow, and within his cabin, Silas stood motionless, listening to the echo of that choice settling into the quiet. The storm did not pass with the dawn. Instead, it tightened its grip, wind sweeping snow into towering drifts that buried fences and swallowed the narrow path between the two cabins. Inside his sturdy home, Silas kept the fire steady, adding logs with measured care, though the warmth now seemed heavier, as if the air itself carried an unspoken accusation. Across the drifted yard, Elias's chimney smoked weakly, the thin ribbon of gray rising uncertainly before vanishing into the pale sky. On the third day, the church bell did not ring, its rope frozen stiff, its sound trapped within the ice that clung to its iron frame. Villagers stayed indoors, rationing flour and salt pork, speaking in low voices by lantern light, each family guarding what little remained of autumn's labor. Silas counted his stores again, touching each sack of grain, each cured slab of meat, as though reassurance could silence the faint unease pressing at his chest. That night, the wind shifted violently, striking from the north, prying at shutters, forcing snow through even the smallest seams in wood and stone. Silas woke to a distant crash, muffled yet unmistakable, followed by a sound he could not at first place, a long, fragile splintering carried on the storm. He rose with lantern in hand, peering through frost-clouded glass toward Elias's cabin, but the world beyond was a blur of white and moving shadow. By morning, word spread in hushed tones that part of Elias's roof had given way beneath the weight of snow, collapsing inward during the darkest hour before dawn. A small group of men gathered, wrapping scarves around their faces, forcing a path through drifts that reached their waists, each step an exhausting labor. Silas watched from his doorway, gripping the frame, feeling the bite of cold against his skin, yet he did not join them. He told himself the storm remained too fierce, that his own safety mattered, that responsibility had boundaries drawn by preparation and foresight. The men returned hours later, faces pale, eyes lowered, their boots heavy with snow, and something unspoken. Elias had been found inside, weakened by fever and cold, barely conscious, his wife tending to the child who burned with illness beside a dying fire. They carried the family to the church, the only building large enough to shelter them all, stacking blankets near the altar, lighting a desperate blaze in the iron stove. From his window, Silas saw lanterns flicker in the frozen twilight, figures moving against the snow like fragile silhouettes struggling against a vast white silence. That evening, a young boy from the village appeared at Silas's door, cheeks red from wind, hat trembling in his hands. "Mr. Turner," the boy said softly, "they are asking if you might spare wood. The church stove eats fuel faster than we can find it." Silas hesitated, the request striking deeper than the first, for now it was not only Elias, but the gathered town waiting upon his answer. He looked once more at his carefully stacked provisions, at the fortress he had built against fear, and again he chose restraint over compassion. "I have calculated my stores for my own survival," he replied, voice low but firm, "and winter has not yet finished with us." The boy nodded silently, disappointment flickering across his young face, before stepping back into the drifting snow. That night, the wind fell strangely still, leaving a silence so complete that every creak of timber sounded like a whispered judgment in the dark. Before dawn, a cry pierced the stillness, sharp and sudden, carrying across the frozen valley like a blade drawn swiftly through cloth. Silas rose from his bed, heart pounding, unsure whether the sound had come from a dream or from the world beyond his shuttered windows. Another cry followed, this one weaker, threaded with grief, and he knew it came from the church where lanterns had burned through the night. He stepped outside without coat or hat, the cold biting instantly at his skin, snow crunching loudly beneath his boots in the unnatural quiet. A thin column of smoke rose from the church chimney, wavering uncertainly against the pale sky, as though even fire struggled to hold its place. Villagers stood gathered near the door, their shoulders bowed, their faces etched with a sorrow too heavy for words. Silas approached slowly, each step deliberate, yet his breath came unevenly as a dread he could not name tightened around him. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and fading embers, and near the altar lay Elias's small daughter, her fever finally stilled in the coldest way. Her mother wept softly beside her, rocking back and forth, while Elias lay weak upon a cot, eyes hollow, staring at nothing at all. No one spoke when Silas entered, yet several pairs of eyes turned toward him, not in anger, but in quiet understanding. He saw then the nearly empty woodpile beside the iron stove, the thin blankets stretched across too many shivering bodies, the cost measured not in numbers, but in breath. A weight settled upon him heavier than any drift of snow, pressing into his chest, making each inhale a struggle against his own memory. He remembered the knock at his door, the plea carried in a steady voice, the promise of repayment offered with dignity despite need. Silas stepped forward at last, removing his gloves slowly, as if shedding a layer of pride that had long shielded him from consequence. "I have wood," he said quietly, the words raw against his tongue, "and food enough for many days." But the wind outside had already carried away what might have been saved, and within those walls, no storehouse could reverse the turning of time. In the days that followed, the storm finally loosened its hold, sunlight returning hesitantly to the valley, glinting against snow that seemed too bright for the sorrow it covered. Silas opened his storehouse doors wide, carrying wood and grain to the church without being asked, stacking supplies where all could see. No one refused his offerings, yet gratitude was quiet, subdued, wrapped in the understanding that generosity delayed can never become rescue. Elias survived the winter, though grief carved deep lines into his once gentle face, and his wife spoke less often, her laughter lost somewhere beneath the drifting snow. Silas worked beside the townsfolk come spring, repairing roofs, mending fences, offering labor without complaint, yet something within him remained unsettled. At night he would sit by his hearth, staring into flames that once brought comfort, now hearing instead the faint echo of a knock beneath the crackle of burning wood. He had protected his provisions, guarded his survival, and yet he had learned that safety built without compassion stands colder than any winter wind. Years later, when children asked about the harsh winter of 1849, elders would speak softly of storms and sacrifice, and of a choice made behind a closed door. And in that valley, people learned that some mistakes don't echo loudly, they whisper for generations.